surge of refugees, no breakthrough has materialized. I am so delighted this morning to welcome Benjamin Haddad, Senior Director of the Europe Center at the Atlantic Council, who will share his analysis on the ongoing conflict on President Putin's miscalculation, and as well as Europe's policy transformation vis-à-vis Russia. So bienvenue, Benjamin, at Global Tremors.
Thanks for having me.
So for everybody watching, as we normally do here on Global Tremors, we're going to start off with a couple of big news items. So as everybody saw yesterday, the first round of senior level talks of Ukrainian and Russian foreign ministers took place without major breakthrough. The only big positive to report for everybody watching right now is at least both parties agreed to pursue a framework to reinforce the safety of Ukraine's nuclear installations, which has been quite controversial. Vice President Kamala Harris was in Warsaw, and she announced the delivery of 2 American Patriot missile systems. And Dmitry Medvedev, the Vice President of the National Security Council, has threatened to nationalize assets of foreign companies who have pulled out. So, Ben, a lot to get to right now. The conflict has been going on for 2 weeks. We've had multiple rounds of peace talks. It doesn't look one way or another that a party is going to give. So, from your reading right now, what do you make of the current situation on the ground?
Well, I think you mentioned a miscalculation from Vladimir Putin, and I think that's the right word. I think Putin underestimated 3 factors. He underestimated the extent of the resistance from Ukrainians, the heroic resistance. And I think that's linked to the fact that he may have started believing in his own propaganda. When you listen to his speeches where he's denying the very existence of the Ukrainian nation, or when he's calling the democratically elected leadership of Ukraine a Nazi junta, drug addicts, etc. We're used to this sort of propaganda. What's more surprising, I think, for observers here is that he really seems to have believed it, and he seems to have even maybe based some of his military strategy upon it. When initially, he called on the military, Ukrainian military, to overthrow President Zelensky, when they seemed to be hoping to go directly to Kiev to decapitate the political leadership, and then that the rest of the system would fall like a house of cards. I think he deeply misunderstands that Ukrainians are a nation. They want to live free in dignity. They want to get closer to the European Union. And that's why they're resisting. I think that's the first factor that he underestimated. The second factor he underestimated was the extent of the Western reaction. And it's true that if you look at the last 22 years, where he was always a gambler. He did try a lot of reckless things, from the annexation of Crimea to interference in our democratic processes, the intervention in Syria, or murdering political opponents abroad in our own democracies. Each time, you had a wave of sanctions, condemnations, and then pretty quickly things went back to normal, sort of. Here, clearly, something snapped, something happened. You see a unprecedented mobilization of public opinions, civil societies, but also, of course, of governments, with different waves of very tough sanctions that will, I think, considerably erode his budgetary margins of maneuver, but also the weapons delivery to Ukraine, the economic support to Ukraine. And we can talk in more detail, but just one example: a few weeks before the invasion, we almost took off the idea of de-swifting key banks off the table because we could not build a consensus upon it. And we did build a consensus. Same thing on sanctions on the central banks, same thing on sanctions against oligarchs and members of the regime. So I think we may even be surprised at the strength of our own reaction. I'm not saying this to be self-congratulatory. I think we have to be very vigilant because we're in the long haul. But I think he underestimated this, the cost of aggression. And the third factor that he may have underestimated as well is even the anger of his own population. And you see very courageous mobilizations right now in the streets of Russia, which leads, unfortunately, to an almost totalitarian repression. Russia was already a very close authoritarian regime, but we see the last remnants of an open debate in civil society that are being repressed, from Facebook and Twitter being closed, the last independent media, Echo Moscow, and others being closed as well. A new law that
6 to 15 years for protesters.
15 years for protests, or for just promoting an alternative view of the conflict in Ukraine, basically saying the truth about the war in Ukraine. So I think all of this is making Vladimir Putin's calculus more costly. And maybe, some people around him will start wondering what kind of adventure he has launched. But once again, I say this very cautiously. It's been a couple of weeks. We're all amazed, I think, at the bravery of Ukrainians that are fighting for their freedom. But we also know that we've seen the increase in violence and targeting of civilians in places like Kharkiv, Mariupol, with horrible images just a couple of days ago, and maybe tomorrow, Kyiv. So this is going to be a long and difficult conflict.
Yeah, I mean, let me take your points in reverse order. I mean, it goes without saying that all of those people who are out in the streets, Novosibirsk, Moscow, St. Petersburg, they are in themselves heroes, willing to risk 6 to 15 years of prison. And you see just the brutal assault on these people. I mean, no holds bar. One thing that stands out for me, in Austria on ORF, the Austrian national TV, the first day this law passed and they were reporting live, I mean, you could see that the reporters were visibly shaken about sort of saying the incorrect word. And they said live on air, I'm sorry, we have to use the special language. Before we go to the next question, and you've brought up a lot of good points about Putin's miscalculation, a lot of stuff has started to come out, whether it's on Twitter or by analysis, about how this was really an operation that was only organized by a handful of people. He seems to have been really overconfident with sort of this limited involvement and the huge success they had, whether it was in Crimea, which was bloodless, or with Syria. And like you said, I mean, he's completely underestimated the Ukrainian population. Why do you think that he kept it in such a closed door situation where it was only a handful of people? And clearly from military experts, there was no red team exercise. I mean, even though it was a full-scale invasion, there is multiple problems on supply chains, logistics, and even the fighters they have sent in have been conscripts all the way from Vladivostok. So, I mean, maybe this, in your opinion as an expert, why is Putin, keeping this so close to his chest when it probably would have been more effective, having a larger analysis of the invasion?
Look, it's very complicated to speculate about Putin's behavior and intentions, obviously, because we're not in his head, and by the way, there was this weird debate before the invasion about people saying, well, it's not in his interest to do so. He doesn't want to do it. He's bluffing. Like, we're not in his head. What we can see are the facts on the ground, which is that you had 100 and then 150 and then 200,000 soldiers at the border, and you had clearly threatening speeches coming from Putin. So you have to get a little nervous and wary. Look, I think there's a few things. I mean, what we hear indeed from, for example, the first prisoners of wars that have
all the footage,
that have started talking, is that they were not aware that they were going to war. They thought they were being part of some sort of large-scale exercise. Only a handful of very highly ranked generals knew that they were going to war, and apparently they were shocked. The soldiers were shocked that they had been told for months, for years, that this was a sister nation, that there was a brotherhood between Russia and Ukraine, and now they were being sent to kill Ukrainians. And the reports that we're getting from the battlefield is that apparently you have very low morale among Russian troops, that you may even have some desertions. So I think that's all playing into this. Look, Putin for a long time, in the last couple of years, what many observers and analysts seem to be saying about the functioning of the Russian system, my colleague Ben Judah had an interview about this just a couple of days ago in the French press, is that Putin has shrunk into a sort of bubble of isolation and paranoia linked to COVID. He seems to be very worried about catching COVID. He's getting much fewer contacts with the outside world, with outside advisors. We don't know how informed he is. So clearly there is a problem of paranoia, and there's a problem of access of information to him. I think that's one element. The other element is that, he might have been trying, as crazy as this sounds, because we saw the images of hundreds of thousands of soldiers going to the border, maybe he still thought that he could dissimulate, that he could keep an element of surprise. And I think this is where the American communication strategy, which was really interesting, very aggressive,
top notch, right,
to the war, was so efficient, right? I think you have a lot of people around President Biden who have spent the last few years, studying questions of disinformation, information warfare, propaganda. A lot of people have been traumatized in the United States and Washington since Russia's interference in the 2016 presidential election. So there's been so much work done on, how do we as democracies fight disinformation warfare? Because we can't do propaganda on our own. We can't do disinformation on our own. The strength of our system is transparency. It's not going for, the kind of propaganda that Russia does. So I think here what they did is expose very openly everything they had, everything they knew about Russia's intentions, which had a few advantages. One was clearly to preempt any kind of provocation or propaganda. We know in these conflicts that Russia generally makes up some sort of incident at the border, fabricates an incident and a pretext to be able to go in. And so here you had the fact that America was preempting that, added to the fact, by the way, that President Zelensky was extremely cautious in his own communication. I think that it was actually very complementary to what the United States was doing, because he was refusing any kind of alarmism, any kind of provocation or panic, and was just saying, we're getting ready, we need weapons, we need money, but will not fall into any kind of trap set by Putin. So I think on the information space, that strategy was quite efficient. It was clearly efficient in another realm, which was mobilizing allies, to have a strong front of deterrence, and then now today to implement sanctions and support Ukraine. I think the fact that the United States was very transparent with what it knew, what it had to different allies, also clearly managed to build a strong transatlantic unity.
And consensus. I mean, and I think also, before we get to the next question, a lot of the people in the Biden administration, whether it's Anthony Blinken or Jake Sullivan, they were all part of the 2014 debacle with Crimea. And I think sort of they've taken the energy out of the information narrative. They've shared a lot of the intelligence with the allies, and they've just sort of debunked it, where in some cases, even with this false flag, Russia wasn't even trying. And, if you watch the press conference with Jen Psaki recently, she was also sort of laying the groundwork that, listen, everybody, don't be surprised if there's a chemical attack. So I couldn't agree with you more that they've gotten ahead of the information war. And it's even desperate in Russia, right? Because, I mean, again, if you saw this interview with Putin and all of the Aeroflot stewardesses, there's a lot of evidence that suggests that he wasn't even there virtually. So, I mean, for everybody, it's a bit disconcerting, where he is mentally and how he's only being surrounded by yes men.
Yeah.
Ben,
that being said, if I can bounce off on something, because there is also some sort of narrative that's emerging that he might just be crazy or irrational, and I don't think he's irrational. I think he may have made a bad calculus. He may have clearly been overly optimistic because he's poorly informed, and underestimated the cost. Because once again, if you look at the last 22 years, there's a lot of things he did that in retrospect appear almost normal or unsurprising, but that were really reckless gambles at the time. And, this time he might have thought, okay, this will be a little tougher. We'll have more sanctions. We'll have more international condemnations, maybe 20, 30, 40% more than usual. So he extrapolated the past. And I think here the mobilization is on the order of magnitude larger than so far than what we've seen in the past. And this is usually how democracies work. I mean, we're messy, we're divided, we're slow. And then suddenly there's a sort of psychological shock that's difficult to predict even for ourselves. And we snap into action. And then you have, I think, a very strong mobilization.
Yeah. For everybody joining us right now on Global Tremors, we're here with Ben Haddad from Atlantic Council, unpacking where we are on the Ukraine crisis, information warfare. Ben, let's roll the dice a little bit. We're talking about Putin be a gambler. One thing that, that stands out for me is like he's taken calculated risk, right? I mean, and like you said, he clearly has put a lot of thought into preparing for this. As they clearly didn't prepare enough. I mean, nobody expected the central bank to have half of the assets frozen. Moving forward, as I mentioned earlier, we've had some talks already. I mean, things are only going to get worse domestically. There's reports coming out in Russia that, there's a bank run, capital controls. I mean, it's just a very dire economic situation for the middle class. I mean, where do we see this going? Does Putin have to double down in Ukraine? Or, I mean, do you think there's actually a chance that he'll take a diplomatic off-ramp? Because, I mean, the opening salvo from Dmitry Peskov about what, peace for Russia meant was essentially capitulation of the Ukrainian state. So, I mean, what do you make of, is he even interested in a diplomatic off-ramp or,
Look, when you listen to the way Russian officials are speaking right now, clearly they have very maximalist goals and ambitions that go to the very denying of the existence of Ukraine as an independent state. I mean, the three objectives that Russian officials have laid out are denazification, whatever that means. They consider that the political leadership in Ukraine is somehow Nazi, neutralization, demilitarization. So
and recognition of Crimea, right?
Well, the recognition of Crimea being one of the subsections of that, right? But so right now, these conditions are unacceptable for any kind of Ukrainian leadership, of course, and they go way beyond what you could have in a normal negotiation. And Putin has shown already, because we exposed that he's not interested in diplomacy. I think all the diplomatic efforts that were made in the weeks leading up to the war by Macron, by Scholz, by Biden, were really important in this respect, because we went all the way. We tried to reignite the Minsk agreements, and Zelensky was open to discussing the question of status in Donbass, arms controls within the OSC. He's the one who closed the door on this, and he's the one who clearly said he was not interested and chose war and violence. And I think this, first we needed to try. It was important to go all the way to try to prevent this war. But then I think that was also very important today to mobilize allies, Europeans and Americans, because we can prove to our public opinions, to everyone, that we went all the way in trying to find a diplomatic solution. I think the only way to hope today for a peaceful and diplomatic exit to this is to increase the cost of aggression on Russia, right? It's to rebalance the force on the ground. And so give Ukrainians the means to defend themselves and continue to supply them with weapons, continue to increase the economic cost on Russia, and maybe at some point give the incentive to Russians to sit down and have maybe a real conversation. But right now, I mean, every observer and official seem to be pretty pessimistic about where we're going to go in the next few weeks, that Russians have decided to, on the contrary, increase the violence on civilians, and they're targeting directly hospitals, schools,
maternity wards,
official buildings, media. And this is a strategy that we've seen before. I mean, that's a strategy that they used in Grozny and Chechnya. Just a few weeks after Putin became prime minister in 1999, he launched the second Chechen war. That's the strategy that they used with their ally Bashar al-Assad in Aleppo. So these are not accidents. This is a deliberate strategy. But the only way today to hope to get to some sort of diplomatic off-ramp is to increase the cost. So we should continue to do this. But I think it's also welcome that some are trying, that the French, the Israelis, the Turks are using their own diplomatic channels to keep link open between Ukrainians and Russians. We have to be, I think, extremely lucid and have no illusion over what we can accomplish maybe in the short term, but continue trying, as long as it doesn't break unity on sanctions and on supporting Ukraine. But I think right now there's a pretty strong front.
I mean, Ben, we're entering the last part of our interview, but I really feel the need just to push back a little bit, because I mean, like you said, the costs are only rising on Russia. But the thing is, like, even if you consider that, of the apparent 6,000 deaths of the Russian soldiers, which is equivalent to half of all of the Soviet deaths during Afghanistan, it seems as if like this is the only option that this is really producing, is to punish Putin as opposed to stopping him. And even on the sanctions, this is just about driving, his war chest down to nothing. But I mean, do you believe some of the military analysts who are saying that, it will take a military confrontation to actually stop him, because he will just ramp the repression, where we are really sort of back in time Soviet Union about media rationings of goods? I mean, it's insane for us to read these articles to see how it's going. So, I mean, he himself has an unbelievably high threshold of pain. And even, the DOJ yesterday with Merrick Garland, they have a new special task force to go and hunt assets of the oligarchs. I mean, even if the oligarchs start to, throw up a fuss, do you think he still will have to go through with his current plan? Because I just don't see where he'll, there's no graceful exit like Nixon talked about leaving Vietnam.
Well, first, I mean, look, on the high threshold of pain, I don't know if that's true. I mean, I know Russians love to say that, and that's a part of the propaganda and the mythology that are creating around this. In 2014, 2015, when we started imposing sanctions, they were definitely not as tough as the one we're doing right now. And when you start having coffins of young Russian soldiers who are supposed to be not fighting in the Donbass, but who are still dying, and you start having mothers mobilizing, that put pressure on the regime. That's the moment where they also sat down to start discussing ceasefire in Minsk. Now, the Minsk agreements, of course, were more favorable to Russia and were reflecting the reality on the ground, but they were still somewhat pressured into this. Russian diplomats publicly say that they don't mind about sanctions, but then in private for years, they've actually asked Europeans and Americans to lift them. So I wouldn't also overestimate, I don't have a mythological view about their
pain tolerance.
But I also don't think there's any other option right now. First, Ukrainians are asking us to help them support themselves. So we have to do that. There's both a strategic and a moral responsibility to do so. But it's true that, I agree with President Biden and most NATO leaders that there is a line to be drawn at entering direct confrontation ourselves. I think for example, with a no-fly zone or NATO troops, I think here the risks of escalation at this point would be immense. And we have to be responsible. We also have to think about, how American and European publics would react to this. So I think there's a lot we can do to increase the cost of aggression without starting a direct NATO-Russia confrontation.
Yeah, and we could have had a whole Global Tremors just on that issue, but I want to get to the last question here, and everybody watching on Global Tremors, we're here with Ben Haddad from Atlantic Council. Ben, you're a European, a Frenchman living in the United States, back in Europe right now. As you started off in some of your earlier comments, nobody, some of the early positions about de-swifting or the dropping of Nord Stream 2 were just complete taboo. We're 2 weeks over the war. I mean, you as a European, what do you make of this absolutely transformational phase of the EU, whether it's the bloc itself or countries like Germany who have reversed decades of foreign policy?
Yeah. Look, I think it's certainly a wake-up call. I balk a little bit at the idea of calling it a turning point, because I think we had wake-up calls before that we just ignored, right? I mean, in the 90s, we had war in the Western Balkans, which are closer to France and Germany than Ukraine are, but we still decided to think these were sort of sporadic calls back to the world of yesterday rather than representative of the world of today. Then we had the war in Georgia in 2008. We had already the annexation of Crimea and the invasion of the Donbass in 2014. With the war in Syria, which direct security consequences on Europe with the rise of ISIS and terror attacks.
Refugees, obviously.
And the refugee crisis, of course. But I think clearly something happened now, and we have to draw the long-term consequences for it. I think the fact that Germany has decided to increase its defense spending, invest 100 billion euros in updating its military equipment, that you see Sweden breaking with neutrality and supporting weapons delivery to Ukraine. You have decisions also historically in Poland increased its defense spending to 3%. Denmark is doing a referendum.
Finland's thinking about NATO now.
Is thinking about NATO. I do think, we talked a lot in the last few minutes about the short-term measures we have to take to support Ukraine. I think there's also a long-term generational effort towards rearmament, material rearmament, but also I would say even intellectual rearmament, rethinking like a power, understanding that you're surrounded by an environment of threats from Russia, strategic rivalry with China, terrorism, and that you have to step up to it. I think the European Union has been extraordinarily successful at being able to overcome centuries of conflict on the European continent. I think it's one of the most successful political projects in history. However, it has not really prepared us intellectually to understand the rest of the world with which we deal. That does not, has not replaced conflict with economics, law, and transnational norms. So this is the balance that we have to find, but I think it's really time to invest in our own sovereignty militarily and rearm, do it at the level of member states, but also really do it at the European level, invest more, coordinate more. If you take all the military spending of European countries combined, we're number 2 after the United States. That's translating to real capabilities and the ability to wait as a collective military power. Of course not right now. So that's, should really be one of the priority in the next few years. Same thing for energy. We've realized now, although a lot of people had been saying it for years, that energy is not used by Russia as a commodity on the market, where you have purchasers and clients. It's a political tool. It's an arms of influence in our own democracy. So we should really, really invest in renewables, in nuclear energy, in diversifying relationships, so that we stop completely depending on Russian energy in the next few years. There were some decisions that were just announced in Versailles in that respect. I think that's really important. And then our technology sovereignty. So I think, maybe, and I say just maybe because it depends on us and it depends on the decisions that we make in the next few months and year, this could be the beginning also of Europeans starting to think as a power on the world stage. Yeah.
Well, Ben, we're about to end right here. And thank you so much for unpacking complicated issues from Putin's miscalculation. And also, I think you brought a really fresh perspective to Europe's transformation, as you said in German, Zeitenwende, which is really a transformational point. And you haven't cooled it, but you sort of said to keep expectations in line. And, for everybody watching, if you want to get that out there, Ben had a great line about sort of Europe's intellectual rearmament, where, although there were opportunities to take this big step, it really took an unbelievable shock. As it did. And like you said, Yugoslavia was even closer to Germany and France, but we are where we are. And of course, transparency is one of the core strengths of democracy. It's messy, it's unpleasant, but again, at the end of the day, that's our biggest strength. So Ben, thanks so much for this early edition of Global Tremors. It's been a real pleasure. And for everybody watching, we're going to be back at 2:45 to talk cyber with Andrew Lee of ESET. So thanks again, man.
Thanks for having me.
Ciao.